Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week we're going to build a Markdown editor with code syntax highlighting. Now, we already have some Markdown support in the rich text editor, but it only works for initializing it. You can use Markdown to set the default value, but then when you're actually writing in it, you just write normally and then use the toolbar to apply formatting. And the output of the rich text editor is rich text. It doesn't output Markdown, so it just has some support for Markdown, but it's not a true editor. So today, we're going to build a true Markdown editor with different view modes for edit, preview, and side-by-side. And then we're going to add code syntax highlighting using PrismJS so that there's different colors for keywords, and it will auto-detect the language and apply the right syntax highlighting based on the code. So let's get started. First, we're going to check out the docs for Marked in PrismJS, and then we'll take a quick preview of the app we're about to build before we jump into coding. All right, let's check it out. Okay, here's the first library we're going to use. This is marked, and this will take a markdown string and convert that to rendered markdown with HTML styling. So let's look at how to import it and use it. Before we get to that though, just a quick note. I'm not going to mess with using DOM Purify or sanitizing the HTML, but you should definitely understand this here and consider it for any production app. So if the user were to type or paste in some raw markdown that included some HTML, this is going to convert the markdown for you and then just leave behind whatever else was there, right? And that could include some malicious HTML. So you'll want to sanitize this, but for this demo today, I just want to focus on building a markdown editor, show you how to do the code syntax highlighting, and then you'll want to sanitize that before you actually send it to the document. But okay, so anyway, what you want to do is import the library, and then you have a div that you want to target. So this is where we're going to put the output of the rendered markdown. So you've got some div with an ID, import the library, and then you just run, well, you select it with document, whatever, get by its ID or query selector, and then just set the inner HTML to marked.parse of the markdown string. And then that will put HTML, the styled version of it, in here. So this library is really easy to use. Just import it, give it a div, and then say mark.parse. And then for Prism, the next library here we're going to use, this one you'll want to import the library and some CSS because it's going to have different themes and different languages that it has support for. Now they don't have a good example here, so let's check out their website. And when it comes to importing it, there's a section here that talks about using a CDN. Here we go. So you'll import the CSS, the core library, and then you may also import other plugins. And then once they're imported, there's a few different syntaxes you can use. Prism.highlight has several parameters here. There's the code that you want to highlight, the plugin, the part of Prism that you're going to use for that, and then the language itself. And the plugin could support multiple languages, which is why you got to say which one to use. But in this case, they're both JavaScript, so that's a little more complex. There's an easier method. It's just prism.highlightAll. So that's what we're going to use. That'll just do the entire document and look for any type of code block that should be highlighted. It'll auto detect the language. So to see what the end result looks like here, let's check out the finished app before we start building. Okay, so we got a side-by-side markdown editor. We can go to full view or full preview. And then in the split screen here, as you're typing, you can see it start to render that markdown. And we also have support for code blocks. So if I do a console.log here, now you can see that it is using a monospace font and it added that background color. But there isn't actual color on the text itself. It's just the background because I haven't told it what language yet. So if I add that JavaScript here, you can see it's just added the color. So We have view modes, parsing of Markdown, and actually displaying it, and then the code syntax highlighting. That's our MVP of what we're trying to build today. And then the save button will just store the Markdown in the Appsmith model so that you can get back the raw text. So as the user typing, you'll type Markdown. You can display it just to preview it, but then when you save it, you'll be saving the Markdown again. All right, so what we're going to do is switch to a new blank page here and just start rebuilding this from scratch now that we've kind of seen how the basics work. So I'm going to drag in a custom widget. And then we'll go to edit the source here. And first, I'm just going to clear out everything, all 3 tabs here. And then I have a tutorial on the community portal for this. And we're just going to come here to copy a few things. So first, we're going to start out with most of the HTML, and then just kind of incrementally build up on the JS side. So to kind of avoid throwing too many things at you at once here, we'll keep this simple. You can see that these buttons are just placeholders. There's no action, there's no function connected or anything. So I'm just kind of putting those there in a div for the toolbar as a placeholder. And we're just going to focus on these 2 right now to see how this connects to view and how you link to a function and a variable. Now, the text area is going to be populated by a variable called Markdown. That will be the raw input. And if you're just starting out, you're just starting a new file or whatever, that would be blank. But you might also use this custom widget to edit an existing file, right? So you need a way to pass in and initialize it. And we're going to call that variable Markdown. And then the text area is getting it using this vModel directive. That's a view directive that just says to look at the model where we're going to declare all of our variables using ref, and that's where it will find that. So then we're using @input to tell it the name of the function that we want to run when the user types in this text area. So right now it's not doing anything when I type, because I only have the HTML. I don't have view imported yet or any functions. There's no function called render markdown yet, but that's where we're headed. And then I've got the div for the preview, and this one is going to populate based on the compiled markdown. That's the variable that I'm going to name coming out of the render markdown function. So I'll input markdown to populate the text area. When the user types, we'll run a function called render markdown, and that will output a variable called compiled markdown to display in this div. You can't see it below here, but the div right after the text area. Okay, so that's where we're heading with the HTML side. Let's go back to the tutorial here, and I'm going to copy this section, and then we'll talk about what it does here in the JS. So here we're importing marked so that I can call it right here. And then from view, we're importing create app, which I'm using here. It's using the view 3 composition API. So we're using a setup function instead of data and methods in the old view 2 options API approach. If you're not familiar with that, if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. I'm just now learning view, and skipping ahead to the newer composition API. So just wanted to point out we're trying the newer view method here. Okay, so inside of this now we're using create app to define it, and then inside I'm using ref and watch. Ref is how you declare a variable, and we're just saying compiled markdown is going to start out being declared as an empty string, and then here's where I'm assigning it a value. So you just declare them first, and then you can use it in a function. And then in that function, I'm setting the ref's value for compiled markdown. I'm setting it to marked, where it's running marked on the variable called markdown. This one is going to be defined by what we pass into the custom widget. So here in a minute, we're going to go back to the main app editor and pass in some markdown, and then this will render that markdown and give us back that compiled markdown value. Okay? And then we want to watch the variables Markdown, the function render Markdown, and update the UI immediately when those change. And then lastly here, we're just returning these things so that they're available outside of the JS and back in the HTML. And then run mount app. So that's the basics here. I think we've got enough connected and working. Yeah, so that's our basic Markdown editor. But you'll notice that that bullet didn't work. Let's see what else works and doesn't work here. So if I do the 3 underscores, that made a horizontal rule here. Let's see, header 2. So that's working. Console's in the way here, but certain things are working, but that list didn't work. Let's try a code block. All right, that's that has a monospace font, so it is doing something with the backticks, and we don't have the code syntax highlighting yet, so I wouldn't expect that. But basically, what I'm getting at here is we have an issue with the list, and let's look at numbered lists. Okay, so you see that it's working with most, but it doesn't like lists. It's not showing the indicator, whether it's ordered or unordered list. And we also have no padding. That's like right up on the edge and looks bad. Both of these can be fixed with some CSS. And I am not the person to take CSS advice from here, so I'm just going to paste this in and wave a magic wand. And then as far as the exact explanation, you'll have to ask ChatGPT like I did. So let's paste this here. It's basically this ordered and unordered lists. You got to give them some padding and tell it the list type. So I'm not sure why it doesn't work by default, but that's the fix. And now the lists are working. There we go. Okay, so that's our basic Markdown editor. These view modes aren't working yet. The save button's not working. We don't have the code syntax highlighting, but that's kind of the bare min MVP to just have an input and output and have Markdown displaying. So let's go back to the tutorial. Look at what's next here. I think we're doing buttons next now that that's fixed. Oh, saving to the model. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is grab that value that the user has typed and get it outside of the custom widget so we can do something with it. So we're going to save it to the model. I'm going to copy this really close to what we already had, and we'll just update this JS. So just a few more lines here. I am defining the save markdown function now, which just does the console.log and then runs appsmith.model or update model. And it's setting a value called markdown with the value from our markdown ref here. So if I look at the live model going into the custom widget, it's still using that default example with tips like the custom widget comes with. And that's all that's in there is that array. So now that we have a function called markdown and we have a save button, if we update the save button here to tell it what to do when you click the save, that should connect those. I think I have that typed here as well. Maybe I skipped that step on the tutorial. I will have to go back and fix that. So what we want to do is update this button to have a @click. Let's do that. Equals. I think that's what I called it. Save markdown. Okay. So if you see the tips over here, there's this array of tips, and that's the only thing in there. What's going on this side? Okay, so this will run a save markdown function, and let's go back and check that out. So when we click the button, it should update the model with a value called markdown, taking it from our variable called markdown. So let's just put something in here and save. And you can see it just updated the model. It still has the tips because that's in the custom widget setup right now. And then it added the markdown one. So let's go back to the main editor here and look at that default model. This is left over here from the one that just comes with every custom widget. So I'm going to clear that out, put an object in here, and give it a variable called Markdown. And then we're just going to pass in a string with a header. I'm going to do a new line like this. You can do a /n since we're inside of a string trying to do a new line. And then we'll just do a couple bullet points. So another line return and another bullet point. And we will pass that in as the initial value for it to render some markdown from that. So let me just format this a little bit. Okay, we're passing in an object with one parameter called markdown. And we'll go back to the main editor here. So it's already looking for that markdown from the Appsmith model. We just didn't have anything there yet, which means if I refresh this, it should instantly load up with that value now. That'll initialize the markdown editor with that text already in there. Here we go. So what's next? We got data coming out of the custom widget. We can get it outside of the widget into the rest of the app. All right, now that we got that part working, let's get these view mode buttons working. So I'm going to go to the edit source again and back to the tutorial. So for this part, we're going to put in those @ clicks for another function called toggle view. And I'm just going to use the same one function for all three buttons and give it a different parameter of I wanted to see the editor or the preview or split view. So we'll just copy all of this, put that into our HTML side here. So we're looking for those functions now for the buttons. And then back to the JS, we need to write the toggle view function and then export it as well. It has to be down here in the export. So let's go back here. I'm just going to copy all of this to save some typing. And okay, so now we have the toggle view, which takes in a mode parameter. Up here, I'm defining another ref and giving it the initial value of split. And then every time you click one of these buttons, it'll pass in that parameter of full view or preview or split, and then just update that variable. Here we have to export it as well, export the view mode and the function to toggle the view mode. And then the rest of it is in the HTML. So if we look at the divs, the other thing I've added besides the buttons here is the vif directive. If you put this inside of a div and then give it a condition, then this whole div will only appear if that's true. So there's a vif condition to just conditionally show and hide those two. And it's got a class so that I can target each one. And then it's going to show or hide based on that view mode variable. So let's put something in here so we can see it. And then we'll switch to full editor. We got full preview and split screen. So that much is working. And I think the last thing now is we just want to add that code syntax highlighting, because if I go JavaScript, yeah, it's still only doing the monospace font, but we're not getting the kind of slow. We're not getting the colors yet. So last part of this, we're going to import a couple more libraries here, or the library and the CSS rather. We'll go back to the HTML side here. So we'll copy that, put it here at the top of the HTML. Oh, I see what's going on here. That script tag is got an extra line. Okay, so we'll import those two. And now that we have Prism back on the JS side here, the main thing is just doing prism.all. I don't think it changes anything else, but I'm going to copy all of it just to be safe here. And let's try this one more time. Hey, there it is. It does not work when you have typos, but once you got the right name for a language there, yeah, we got the code syntax highlighting and the coloring working as well. So there's one other thing we could do. I don't have it in the tutorial. Right here, the only thing I'm doing is updating the model when you click save, but I'm not actually running a function outside of the custom widget. So we'll take this another step here just to get you closer to being able to use this and save it somewhere. Let's say we had an API to save this. I'm just going to add a blank one. We're not going to have a source to send this to, but here's the API where we could be saving this with a post. So I'm going to add an event here. If you look at the event section, it still has this on reset click that was an event that was just part of the default widget. So I'm going to delete that. We're going to add our own event and call it save markdown. And then when you run this event, we want it to perform an action. So event is just a thing you can trigger. You want to run this event name save markdown, and then what does that event do? So there's this other plus that's a little different. So there's the bigger one here to add an event, and then once you're on an event, here is where you can add the action, and I would want this to run that API. So to get this to trigger from the custom widget save button here, we just have to tell it to run Appsmith trigger event and then give it the name. So back here, after that value's been saved, we could say appsmith.trigger event save markdown. And then when I click this button, you'll see both. It has updated the model and it fired an event called save markdown. Now back here, it's going to try to run this API, which doesn't have a URL, so that part's going to fail, but it's trying to run it. And if you connect this to your API, to your database or whatever, from here you can load data in to the custom model. You can edit it, do whatever with it, click save, and then trigger that API or database and save it back to your data source. So I think that's everything I want to show for this week. We went through using the marked library for the markdown and rendering that raw markdown into HTML. And then we saw how to use PrismJS to add that code syntax highlighting. You just need to import the library and the one CSS file for JavaScript. It does HTML, CSS, Python, several libraries that are included by default. And then there's others that you can add with the plugin. And then we built this using the composition API. We've got full screen, preview, and split. So it's a good start to a Markdown editor. There's a lot more you could do. So if you have any questions on this one, if you got ideas of how to extend this, or just idea for future workshops, feel free to drop a comment below. So thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.